The soldier crouched behind a shattered stone wall somewhere in the mud of Western Germany, early 1945. His hands were cold. His knuckles were white around the grip of his M111 pistol. Across the rubble, a German helmet caught the pale winter light. A silhouette, a target, a threat. He squeezed the trigger. The 45 ACP round, 230 grains of lead, the round that legends were built on, struck the rim of that steel helmet at barely 30 yards and bounced off. Not a ricochet in the movie's sense. Not a dramatic spark and a villain stumbling backward. The bullet simply deflected. It shed its energy into the curved steel of the Stahlhelm, lost its momentum to the geometry of the metal, and fell somewhere into the frozen mud, spent and harmless. The soldier stared. The German ran. For decades, no one in the history books talked much about that moment, because it contradicted everything America believed about its most legendary sidearm. This is the story of what the ordnance engineers at Springfield Armory knew, and what a forgotten government test report quietly revealed about the 45 ACP, the M1 helmet, and the dangerous gap between military mythology and ballistic reality. If this kind of deep dive military history is what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode. This community is growing, and we're just getting started. To understand what those tests revealed, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the jungle. The year is 1899. The United States Army has just inherited an insurgency in the Philippines following the Spanish-American War. The enemy is not a conventional opponent. The Moros sit with the Muslim warriors of the southern islands, particularly the Tausug fighters of the Sulu archipelago, are unlike anything American soldiers have encountered since the Indian Wars. They drug themselves before battle. They bind their limbs tightly with rope and leather to restrict blood flow and slow hemorrhage. They pray. They work themselves into a state that American officers described in after-action reports as absolute insensibility to pain. And then they charge. The American soldier's standard sidearm in 1899 was the Colt Model 1892 double-action revolver, chambered in .38 long Colt. On a paper target at 20 yards, it was a fine pistol. Against a charging Moro warrior who had just taken 3 rounds to the chest and was still covering ground at full speed with a double-edged sword, it was a disaster. The reports from the field were chilling. Officers described scenarios where soldiers emptied their revolvers into attackers who didn't go down. The .38 long Colt had been adopted in 1892 on the theory that it was lighter, more accurate, and perfectly adequate for the kind of police and sentry work that composed most of a peacetime soldier's duties. The Army had even convinced itself, in a remarkably candid test report at the time, that the question of stopping power can only be definitely settled by actual trial against living objects. The Philippines settled it definitively. By 1902, the Army was shipping crates of old .45 caliber single-action revolvers back into the Philippines as emergency replacements. The big, slow, heavy bullet of the Colt single-action Army, the gun that had won the American West, was demonstrably more effective at stopping a charging man than the modern .38. The lesson seemed obvious. Size and mass matter. A heavier bullet, even at moderate velocity, puts a man down with a reliability that a smaller, faster round cannot match. That lesson would shape American military thinking for the next 80 years. In 1904, Colonels John T. Thompson and Louis Lagarde conducted what became known as the Thompson-Lagarde tests, a series of experiments at the Chicago stockyards where human cadavers and live cattle were shot with 10 different handgun cartridges. The tests were imperfect by any modern scientific standard. The methodology was crude, the sample sizes were small, and the conclusions were influenced by preconceptions. But the military wanted a number, a caliber, a threshold. Thompson and Lagarde gave them one: 45 inches minimum. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. A large diameter bullet creates a larger wound channel. A heavier projectile transfers more momentum upon impact. At the close ranges typical of pistol combat, rarely beyond 25 or 30 yards in most historical engagements, raw mass and diameter seem to matter more than velocity. The cartridge that emerged from this process was designed by John Moses Browning in 1904 and standardized in 1911, the 45 ACP. A 230-grain round-nose bullet pushed to approximately 830 feet per second from a 5-inch barrel. Not fast, not flat shooting, but massive, authoritative. The kind of round that could, according to the prevailing wisdom, knock a man off his feet. The pistol built around it, the M1911 and its updated successor, the M1911A1, was itself a mechanical masterpiece. During its adoption trials in 1911, it fired more than 6,000 rounds in 2 days of testing without a single recorded malfunction. Even when it overheated, engineers dunked it in a bucket of water and kept going. The 45 ACP and the M1911 entered American military service as a matched set of legends. And the legend grew with every war. In the trenches of World War I, soldiers who had carried both the Colt 45 and captured German Lugers almost unanimously preferred the American pistol's stopping power at close range. In the Pacific, stories circulated about single shots from the M1911 stopping Japanese banzai charges. In North Africa, veterans swore by its reliability in sand and heat. By 1944 and 1945, the 45 ACP had accumulated something more powerful than ballistic data. It had accumulated faith. Faith is a hard thing to test in a laboratory, but the engineers at Springfield Armory were about to try. The document that would challenge this faith was not dramatic. It was bureaucratic. A few typed pages, a test procedure, a table of results, and a cold, factual conclusion. Springfield Armory Memorandum Report, SAMR 20-2100. Subject: effective penetration range of 9mm Parabellum ammunition. Prepared by Ordnance Engineers L.O. Spaulding, H.F. Hawthorne, and Head Ordnance Engineer E.W. Hopkins. The stated objective of the test was to determine the maximum range at which 9mm Parabellum ammunition would penetrate the M1 steel helmet. It was, in essence, a comparative capability study. A question of whether the new Canadian high-power pistol, the Browning High Power made under license by John Inglis and Company in Toronto, offered any meaningful ballistic advantage over the standard American sidearm in field conditions. The test procedure was methodical. An M1 helmet was mounted on a stake at a fixed range. The test pistol was fired from a stable rest, muzzle and elbow supported. If the helmet was penetrated, it was moved back 10 yards, and the test was repeated until the round failed to punch through the steel. The process was then replicated with each ammunition type under evaluation. 4 types of ammunition were tested. First, a Wildcat load, a 9mm Parabellum case loaded with a 38 S&W Special 158 grain bullet, driven to approximately 850 feet per second. An improvised round, an engineer's experiment. Second, Winchester 9mm Parabellum 116 grains at a measured velocity of 1,850 feet per second. Third, Canadian-manufactured 9mm Parabellum, 116 grains at 1,150 feet per second. The hot load, the standard round for the Inglis high power. Fourth, 45 ACP pistol ball M1911, 230 grains at approximately 850 feet per second. The American standard, the legend. The results were entered into the report with clinical neutrality. No commentary, no interpretation, just numbers. The improvised 158 grain 9mm load penetrated the M1 helmet at 50 yards. It failed at 60. The Winchester 9mm at 150 FPS penetrated the M1 helmet at 120 yards. It failed at 130. The Canadian 9mm at 150 FPS penetrated the M1 helmet at 130 yards. The test range did not extend further. The engineers noted that it might have continued to penetrate beyond that distance, but they had no room to find out. The 45 ACP, 230 grains, 850 feet per second, the round that had defined American military stopping power since the jungles of the Philippines, penetrated the M1 helmet at 30 yards. It failed at 35. 35 yards, just over 100 feet, the length of a decent-sized living room, measured twice. At that distance, a distance at which most soldiers could see the expression on an opponent's face, the most celebrated pistol cartridge in American history could no longer reliably punch through a standard steel pot. The Canadian 9mm outperformed the American 45 ACP by a factor of roughly 4-to-1 in helmet penetration range. When you hold those numbers in your hands, the natural question is, why? What is the physics that explains this result? The answer lies in the geometry of the problem, and it begins with the M1 helmet itself. The M1 was made from Hadfield manganese steel, a material that had been the backbone of armored applications since the First World War. It was chosen not because it was the best ballistic steel available, but because it could be mass-produced cheaply and pressed into shape without cracking. Its properties were well understood: tough, work-hardening under impact, relatively resistant to spalling. The official penetration specification for the M1 helmet when it was standardized in 1941 required it to resist a 230 grain .45 caliber bullet traveling at 800 feet per second. The production helmet actually exceeded that spec during Aberdeen proving ground testing. Engineers were proud of this result. It became part of the helmet story. The M1 could stop a .45 at point-blank range. What nobody fully appreciated in the public narrative was the implication of that design choice. The helmet had been specifically engineered to defeat the .45 ACP. It was, in ballistic terms, calibrated to that threat. And because the .45 traveled so slowly, 830 to 850 feet per second at the muzzle, the velocity bled off rapidly with distance. By the time you were at 35 yards, a round that began barely above the helmet's design threshold was already below it. The physics of penetration against sloped or curved steel armor adds another layer to the problem. When a projectile strikes steel at an oblique angle, as it inevitably does on the curved surface of a helmet, two things happen simultaneously. The effective thickness of the steel increases because the bullet must travel through more material along its penetrating path, and the angled surface acts to redirect the bullet's energy, deflecting it away rather than absorbing it directly. A high-velocity, small-caliber projectile, and like the 9mm at 1,250 FPS, carries enough velocity that it can still punch through, even after losing energy to the angled surface geometry. It arrives with enough residual energy to overcome the deflection effect. The .45 ACP, already traveling at a relatively leisurely pace, doesn't have that reserve. Its wide, blunt nose, a shape designed to maximize the wound channel and soft tissue, actually works against it in hard barrier penetration. It presents a large impact face to the steel, distributing the impact energy over a wider area rather than concentrating it on a small point. The curved helmet surface redirects that distributed energy away from the bullet's line of travel. The ballistic limit of the M1 helmet against .45 ACP with a hard lead core was measured at between 542 and 735 feet per second, a significant range of values depending on the exact angle of impact and the precise location on the helmet shell. At 850 FPS, a .45 might just barely break through at point-blank range. At 35 yards, with velocity having decayed to somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 FPS or below, you were right at the edge of that limit, and the curved geometry of the helmet was tipping the odds away from penetration. The 9mm operated in a completely different velocity regime. Its 250 FPS at the muzzle meant that even at 130 yards, it was still arriving with enough residual velocity to overcome the deflection and punch through. The small diameter projectile concentrated its remaining energy on a much smaller contact area. This is one of the foundational paradoxes of terminal ballistics. The properties that make a projectile effective against soft targets are often the opposite of what makes it effective against hard, angled barriers. A wide, heavy, slow bullet creates devastating damage in tissue. A narrow, lighter, fast bullet punches through steel. In the jungles of the Philippines, where the targets had been unarmored human beings, the .45 ACP's characteristics were genuinely advantageous. In the rubble of European towns, where every German soldier wore a steel helmet, those same characteristics became a liability. Step back for a moment and consider the context in which these tests took place. It is late 1944, early 1945. The war in Europe has entered its most brutal urban phase. Soldiers on both sides are fighting through shattered cities, fortified buildings, and hardened defensive positions. Engagement distances in house-to-house fighting are often measured in feet, not yards. But the pistol, as a sidearm, as the last-ditch weapon of officers, NCOs, tankers, artillerymen, and headquarters personnel, is not a 20-foot weapon in the European theater. It is carried for situations where the primary weapon is not available, and those situations can arise at any range. By this stage of the war, German soldiers are well equipped with steel helmets. The Stahlhelm, in its Model 1935 and Model 1942 variants, was made of molybdenum alloy steel with properties broadly similar to the American M1 helmet. British and Allied soldiers similarly wore the Mk3 Tommy helmet. Almost every combatant on the European battlefield, regardless of nationality, had their head protected by steel. And here is the uncomfortable arithmetic of that situation. An American officer or NCO armed with his M19 119I1 pistol, engaging an enemy at ranges beyond 35 yards, could not reliably penetrate the most basic piece of head protection that enemy was wearing. There is a second layer to this vulnerability, one that is rarely discussed in popular accounts. The European winter of 1944 to 1945 was among the coldest in decades. The soldiers of the Battle of the Bulge were fighting in temperatures that sometimes fell well below 0 Fahrenheit. They wore heavy wool overcoats, multiple layers of field jackets, and whatever improvised insulation they could find. German soldiers in particular were often issued padded winter clothing, and American GIs found themselves wrapped in greatcoats and blankets just to survive the cold. The 45 ACP's terminal effectiveness against soft tissue had always been predicated, at least in part, on the projectile striking a relatively unobstructed target. Add multiple layers of heavy winter clothing, wool, leather, padding, and the effective range of the round against even unprotected adversaries shrank further. The bullet's energy, already modest by velocity standards, was absorbed by the clothing barrier before it could do meaningful work inside the body. Soldiers at the front knew something was wrong, even if they couldn't quantify it in ballistic terms. There are accounts in unit histories and veteran memoirs from the European theater of soldiers expressing frustration with the 45 at extended ranges. An Army warrant officer named Gordon McNeil, who carried the M1911A1 for most of the war, later noted that he rarely used it in actual combat, and when he did, its performance at distances beyond point-blank range was unreliable. He was not alone. The mythological stopping power of the 45 had been built on close-range engagements against unarmored, lightly clothed enemies. By 1945, the tactical environment of European warfare had stripped away most of those favorable conditions. While American soldiers were trusting their lives to the M1911A1, the soldiers of Germany and Britain were carrying very different sidearms. The German Wehrmacht's standard sidearm was the Walther P38 and 9mm Parabellum, the same cartridge that had been decimating M1 helmets at 120 yards in the Springfield Armory tests. Earlier in the war, the Luger P08 and 9mm had been the iconic German officer's pistol. Both fired the same standard cartridge at approximately 150 feet per second, giving German officers a pistol round that could engage helmeted targets at ranges 4 times beyond what the American 45 could achieve against the same protection. The British carried the Enfield No. 2 revolver in 38-200, a smaller, lighter cartridge that also outperformed the 45 ACP against the M1 helmet at distance, though not by as dramatic a margin. More significantly, British SOE operatives and commando units were increasingly carrying the Browning high power and 9mm, the same Canadian-made Inglis pistol that had been tested at Springfield Armory, the same one that punched through M1 helmets at 130 yards. Even America's own allies were moving toward 9mm. The Browning high power was carried by Canadian, British, and numerous resistance forces throughout the European theater. The American .30 carbine, issued to officers and NCOs as a lighter alternative to the full M1 Garand, produced a 110-grain bullet at approximately 1,990 feet per second, giving it helmet penetration characteristics far superior to the 45 ACP. The American soldier's standard sidearm was, by the ballistic standards of the European theater, the weakest pistol cartridge in the Allied arsenal when measured against armored targets. This was not a secret inside the ordnance community. The Springfield Armory engineers who wrote Memorandum Report SA MR 20-2100 knew exactly what they were looking at. Their conclusion, written in the neutral language of government engineers, was unambiguous. The Canadian 9mm Parabellum ammunition demonstrated longer range penetration power than any other ammunition tested. They didn't call it alarming. They didn't call it a crisis. They wrote it in a numbered list and filed it. But somewhere between the lines of that report, the implications were clear. The legendary pistol round of the American military, the round that had been adopted to stop fanatics in the Philippines, that had won 2 world wars, that had become synonymous with American combat power, could not penetrate the helmet of a German soldier at the distance of a tennis court. Why did the myth survive? This is perhaps the most important question. The Springfield Armory test was not the only ballistic study that raised questions about the 45 ACM's performance against hard barriers. There were other comparative tests, other observations in the field, other whispers in ordnance circles. And yet the M1911A1 remained the standard American military sidearm for another 40 years until it was finally replaced by the Beretta M9 in 9mm in 1985. The answer lies in the nature of mythology itself, and in a fundamental difference between what a pistol is actually asked to do in combat and what it is imagined to do in peacetime. In the vast majority of pistol encounters in the Second World War, the target was not wearing a helmet. The target was visible from the waist up, unprotected at close range. In those encounters, the 45 ACP's mass and diameter were genuine advantages. A 230-grain bullet striking soft tissue at 850 feet per second creates a permanent wound channel larger than any standard 9mm round of the era. At point-blank range, inside 20 yards, inside 10, the 45 ACP's terminal performance against unprotected human targets was everything the legend claimed. The helmet penetration problem was a niche scenario, real, tactically significant, documented by engineers, but not the scenario that most veterans experienced when they pulled their pistols in anger. They fired at men, not helmets, and the men went down. Every time a 45 ACP solved a problem in combat, it reinforced the legend. The times it failed, the shots that deflected off a steel pot, the rounds that couldn't punch through a heavy overcoat at 40 yards, those failures were absorbed into the noise of combat, attributed to bad luck or bad shooting rather than to the ballistic properties of the cartridge. There is also the matter of institutional momentum. The United States military had invested decades of doctrine, training, logistics, and manufacturing infrastructure in the 45 ACP. Every armorer's manual, every firing range, every crate of pistol ammunition in the supply chain was calibrated to that round. The 1911A1 pistol was already in production by the millions. Changing the standard sidearm cartridge in the middle of a world war was simply not a practical option, regardless of what the ordnance engineers discovered at 35 yards. And then there was culture. The 45 ACP had become something larger than a pistol round. It had become an identity, the American way of war, translated into metal and propellant. Big, powerful, decisive. The idea that a lighter, faster European cartridge might outperform it against a common piece of battlefield equipment was not simply a technical correction. It was a challenge to a story that generations of soldiers had built their confidence on. The report was filed. The 45 ACP remained standard issue. The legend continued. The story of the Springfield Armory helmet test matters today, not because it changes what we think about the M1911 pistol, but because of what it teaches us about the relationship between weapons, warfare, and the stories we tell about both. Modern ballistic science has given us tools that the ordnance engineers of 1945 could only dream of. High-speed photography allows us to observe the deformation of projectiles at the moment of impact. Calibrated ballistic gelatin provides a consistent, reproducible medium for measuring penetration depth and wound channel dimensions. Computer modeling allows engineers to simulate thousands of impact scenarios before a single live round is fired. What that science has confirmed over and over again is the core principle that the 9mm University Brust 45 ACP test revealed in embryonic form. There is no single ballistic property that makes a cartridge effective in all scenarios. The characteristics that maximize wound damage in soft tissue, mass, diameter, energy transfer, are fundamentally different from the characteristics that maximize penetration of hard, angled barriers. Velocity, sectional density, point geometry. Modern body armor has made this distinction even more stark. A standard Kevlar ballistic vest of the type worn by military and law enforcement personnel today will stop a 45 ACP round with minimal backface deformation. It will be defeated by a 9mm plus P round from the right distance. Both facts are simultaneously true, and both are directly traceable to the physics that the Springfield Armory engineers documented at 35 yards on a cold testing range sometime in 1945 or 1948. The United States military's eventual transition from the 45 ACP to the 9mm in 1985 was not primarily driven by the helmet penetration data. It was driven by logistics, NATO standardization, and the higher magazine capacity enabled by the smaller cartridge. But the ballistic case had been quietly made decades earlier in a memorandum that most soldiers never read. There is a broader lesson here, one that goes beyond caliber selection, Every generation inherits equipment and doctrine that was designed for the wars of previous generations. The 45 ACP was the answer to a question asked in the Philippines in 1899. By 1945, the question had changed, and the answer had not. The soldiers carrying M1911A1 pistols on the Western Front were trusting their lives to a weapon philosophy built on a jungle insurgency from 40 years before. This is not a story of incompetence or negligence. The men who adopted the 45 ACP, who refined the 1911, who carried it through 2 world wars, they were not wrong to believe in it. It saved lives. It stopped enemies. The legend was not built on nothing, but it was built on specific conditions, and conditions change. The most dangerous thing in any military system is not the enemy's weapons. It is the unexamined assumption, the piece of received wisdom that has never been properly questioned, the doctrine that has calcified into dogma, the reputation that has outgrown the reality it was built on. The Springfield Armory engineers who filed Memorandum Report SAMR 20-2100 were doing exactly what good engineers are supposed to do. They were asking whether what everyone believed was actually true. And they were writing down the answer even when the answer was uncomfortable. 35 yards, the shot that bounced. The M19A1 pistol was magnificent within its design parameters. Close range, soft targets, immediate threat. Outside those parameters, in the mud and cold of a European winter, against an enemy protected by standard steel, it was something else. It was a legend carrying a gap. And knowing that gap existed, measuring it, documenting it, understanding why it was there, that is what separates serious military history from the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about the weapons we love. The soldiers who carried the 45 ACP were brave men serving their country in the most terrible conflict in human history. This is not their failure. This is the failure of the mythology that surrounded their weapon. A mythology built on real performance in narrow conditions, then extended beyond what the physics could support. The lesson is not that the 45 ACP was a bad cartridge. The lesson is that no cartridge is everything. No weapon is the universal answer. And the moment you stop questioning the reputation and start treating it as sacred fact, that is the moment you lose the edge that good soldiers and good engineers have always earned through honest inquiry. The bullet hit the steel pot, and the steel pot won. That truth was worth knowing in 1945. It is worth knowing today. If this story made you think differently about what you thought you knew, that's exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment with the military myth you want us to investigate next. And if you know someone who swears by the 45 ACP, share this video with them. Not to start a fight, but because the best arguments are the ones built on evidence. We'll see you in the next one.